Next, we are moving on to item 17, which is legislative policy, statutory priorities, Deputy Superintendent Stallings.
Thank you. There we go. I'm just logging on right now to the screen. And we are now on agenda item 17, I believe, and there are two documents that you'll see posted there. And I'll just start by piggybacking on the last thing, or one of the last things that Deputy Superintendent Jones mentioned, which is last month, I believe, or the month before, we brought forward a request or a notification that staff has been working on the question of whether or not the interventions for reading difficulties pilot program should be continued or sunset. It's number 5 on the list on your backup there. And one of the things that Deputy Jones was mentioning is the timing of sometimes the question is whether it's staff asking for something or if it's the legislature that's seeking staff input or your input on a program. This program has been in place for about 3 years. It is now set to sunset coming up, and the Education Interim Committee on November 14th will be reviewing whether or not the legislature should continue the interventions for reading difficulties pilot program. And they have asked our staff's opinion about whether that program should continue or be sunset. And as I mentioned and may not have explicitly stated, it is our staff's recommendation that this program be sunset, and we anticipate that their committee bill will extend the program for an additional 5 years on November 14th. So we wanted to make you aware of that. One thing that we weren't as clear about when the committee reached out to us a month or so ago is that that will trigger a fiscal impact because that program has only ever been funded with one-time money. And so if the program is continued, the legislature will support that program with either some ongoing money or maybe 5 years worth of one-time money. So we wanted to make you aware of that. It's not necessarily something that we as staff are saying you should prioritize this over other things, but we have been asked by the Legislative Interim Committee to give an opinion on whether the program is good or not. And so it doesn't quite meet the threshold of us saying we're advocating for it. It's kind of this awkward space we're in where the legislature has a program now. They are considering whether or not to continue it, and they've asked for our opinion. And so we wanted to just let you know that on November 14th, our staff will likely be called up to ask whether that program should be continued or sunset. The other,
Just 1 second, I think we have a
Oh,
question.
yes.
Board Member Reby?
So the reading difficulties pilot program, I completely trust our staff in making that recommendation, but I just want clarification for myself. K through 3, we saw the biggest reading gains in our data. And so I was wondering, is this part of that program, or we have done something that is taking the place of this program? Because we have a model that works right now, and so I'm just kind of concerned if this is part of that, why are we eliminating it?
yeah, it is not, Jennifer, do you mind if, Vice Chair, if Jennifer Thronson joins us?
Yes, please, that'd be great.
It is not part of the K-3 program, but of course it's related. I think Jennifer can speak to it better than I can.
So it's been a pilot for about 3.5 years, and there's really a targeted approach towards tiered intervention for students who have the most significant reading difficulties but aren't yet qualified for special education. So the main goal of the project is to prevent future special education referrals by giving targeted early intervention in K through 5. So it's really probably an extra appendage to the mainstay of the skeleton of working on K3 reading. It's a layer that we need to continue to develop. What the LEAs that participate found was they didn't have a Tier 3 intervention in place for students who were at most at risk. And this grant project helped them to realize they didn't have it, and they've had to put in a lot of energies to really have that support. And we have other LEAs that could benefit, so expanding the program could also be beneficial.
So this is a Tier 3 intervention that illustrated that we don't have a Tier 3 intervention, and the programs that we have in place right now are replacing this or doing a better job at Tier 3 intervention. So we don't.
Yeah,
Okay.
it was an absence, like everyone in a multi-tiered system of supports think, we have our core instruction and we have interventions.
Uh-huh.
And when they applied for the grants, they applied for tier 2 and we're like, you have a tier 2 in place, but you're really void was
Uh-huh.
a tier 3. So all of them ended up needing a tier 3 intervention for students with really significant reading difficulties. But within the process of this grant, that helped them to realize there was a gap in their programming. And this grant helps to fulfill that gap.
The one that we're getting rid of?
Yeah, well, it's sunsetting. So
Okay.
whether we get rid of it is probably some recommendation from you all as well.
So you recommend that we sunset it and we don't, oh, you don't?
I would recommend it continuing and expanding.
Okay, that's why I was confused. I'm like,
Right.
oh, thank
Sorry,
you, I'm
let me
sorry.
be clear.
So thank you.
Continue and
It
expand
will
the grant.
sunset.
And we don't want it to.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
that's-
So
yeah.
Okay.
it's up this year. So the session, if nothing happens, it will sunset.
Yes, I think I'm not alone in thinking that you were saying
Gotcha.
that we didn't need it anymore. I'm
No,
like,
I would
so
love
why?
it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for clarifying,
Yeah.
because
No, thank you for asking.
Vice Chair, may I?
Yes, fine.
And it's probably the way that Angie, who understands what sunsetting and repeal and why those two are like two negatives that then cross each other out. But repealing the sunset means continuing the program. So I apologize, that's,
a language
I
thing.
used two negatives, but it's a positive. So our recommendation
working.
is to not allow this to sunset. So to repeal the section that would automatically sunset the program. Yes.
Okay.
Good clarification.
Okay.
What is the appropriation for this item?
About 300 right now, right?
Oops, sorry, let me turn you, thank you.
Currently, it was $375 over the course of 3 years. So we were able to engage with 5 LEAs that led a project in each of their LEAs. It was about 14 schools participated. So they started out with targeting specific schools in their LEA to see how this worked. Some of them found it so successful, they expanded it to their other schools, which caused problems for the treatment control group anyway. But they were seeing such success for students that they found ways to expand it. So it really helped to establish a gap analysis that led them to filling that gap, and then led to serve more kids in their LEA. Many of them expanded beyond the initial pilot schools without additional funding, but the funding helped be the catalyst for change.
So then is the request that we would ask for funding for this to be taken out statewide? Because obviously it was piloted with limited funding. So what is the recommendation of staff as far as the funding of
So
this
staff
program?
recommendation would be do $750, either that we could spend over time, so we could not only grow the program and incorporate maybe 10 to 15 LEAs, so $250 a year for 3 years, or do it for 5 years or however long it makes sense to not revisit the program, but to be able to provide more, because $250 gave us 5 LEAs over 3 years. $250,000 over those 3 years. We were able to serve 5 LEAs. $250 a year would allow us to probably do 10 to 15 LEAs. So to expand it on a scope and scale that we can probably handle, and also have enough people who want to compete for the grant without going too wide in scope yet.
Yes, you did a business plan, yeah.
Okay, if you wanted to go to your, oh, sorry, there's a question from Board Member Cannon.
So I'm always a little suspicious when you talk about LEAs, because every individual charter is an LEA. Then we have small LEAs throughout the state of Utah, and we have 4 ginormous LEAs. Were any of the ones that got this program one of the 4 ginormous LEAs?
I'm trying to think where we are. We're
For
no, so we have
250,000.
Provo, Cache, Tooele, Davis got one, and that would be one of your 4. And then, there's another small one. It's escaping me right now, but none of the other 4 applied. Jordan applied at one point, but they did not qualify for the grant, the initial application, and at that point, we'd exhausted dollars. So,
Thank you.
My final question on this, though, is the intent that you use the money to help them to recognize things that they need to know, and then they no longer need the funding, and you can use it for another LEA, or is it you receive the grant and it's ongoing for that LEA over
So
infinite
the way
time?
that we ran it this year was to really build capacity so that when the grant goes away over that 3-year time period, they have the capacity built to continue the programming. They may still need to use local dollars to invest in the curriculum products that they purchased, but the professional learning has been built. So for example, in Cache, they trained a small group of special ed teachers to use the program, and then they built that cadre, and those folks have been training the rest of their schools. And so they built internal capacity to then be able to continue when the grant funds were no longer available, that there's knowledge already built in the LEA that can continue when the grant goes away. So the 3 years, it honestly took 3 years to get this fine-tuned, because the first year they realized what they didn't know. And that's one of the reasons as we move forward, it's going to be helpful to do some training up front around the pitfalls that we experienced through the pilot program to help them prevent from those similar pitfalls with each other. Provo, for example, built a whole MTSS framework after they went through this the first year, and they said, "Whoa, we've got to back up. We don't have MTSS in place the way we thought we did." So when they write the grants, they're supposed to describe their multi-tiered system of supports, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, what they have available, how that works. And what they find is they write it, and then they actually go to implement, and there are gaps. So we're hoping that we can actually help them identify the gaps up front rather than later. So for example, one of the barriers was scheduling. There was not a schedule built to allow for students to get pulled or pushed in for intervention services. And so that was a barrier that we can help them realize up front. Do you have the time dedicated for students to actually get this intervention? And so through the pilot process, the schools realized a number of barriers or lack of systems that I don't think without the grant they would have realized at least as quickly as they did through the grant process.
And so this $750,000 would be a one-time request?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, are there any other questions on this item? Okay, then Angie, if you want to go to the next.
Thank you. Two other bills that I just wanted to remind you that, or let you know, that will likely be discussed on November 14th with the Education Interim Committee. One of them relates to number 3 on this list. The committee, it has a committee bill open related to the Upstart program, which in a lot of ways was prompted by the audit that the legislative auditors did. And we've been giving them feedback on that, working with Sarah Young, Scott Jones, and others here in the office. So I wanted to make you aware of that. And then also the Representative Ward, as many of you know, has been working on legislation that will mirror a lot of the recommendations that the board's School Safety Advisory Committee has been working on. And so that bill will also likely be heard on November 14th. Staff is working and providing feedback on that also. One new request that that we've got from staff that you'll see a document on board docs from our audit section would be to seek out statutory authority for the board to meet in closed session for the purpose of considering a draft audit or investigation report. Those are generally protected and confidential, and there's no, right now, the Open and Public Meetings Act does not allow you to go into closed session for the purpose of discussing a response to an audit. And so the recommendation of staff is to seek that statutory change so that when audits come that pertain to the board, that not just the audit committee, but the full board would be able to see the draft audit and then help inform the response. And so that would be another thing that we'd be looking to start working on this session. And that's all that I have to present.
Board Member Lear.
I had a couple of questions. On the issues about absenteeism, truancy, suspension, those kinds of things, is that a request from a legislator, or you're just, my druthers would be, and I just would ask you to consider this, and then maybe we can talk about it later. My druthers would be to leave as much of that into board control. I don't really want the legislature to be setting what part-time schooling is. If we could do that through board rule, I would rather do that.
Yeah.
Is my druthers. That's just a thought. The truancy, absenteeism stuff, they just barely took out. So it's interesting that somebody's contemplating, or maybe we're asking them to put back in.
Yeah, it's actually staff. So I don't know if you remember a couple of months ago, this actually came out of the Eliminating Barriers Task Force. And as we were, and when I say we, the Eliminating Barriers Task Force was studying some of the causes or questions about student apathy, chronic absenteeism, et cetera. Staff noted that there are different definitions that often mean the same thing in statute, and it's confusing about, for example, is a student truant or absent for the whole day if they're only absent for an hour versus the whole day, and the differing policies on excused absence versus unexcused. Not necessarily that we are going to talk about excused and unexcused, but the Eliminating Barriers Task Force asked staff to consider some recommendations and things that could be changed in code. So this is explicitly language that the staff and then the Eliminating Barriers Task Force studied, and then we made these recommendations, as you can see, on September 6th to the board and you all. There's a document that's much more extensive about the reasoning and why these things we think could be helpful to just have common language, and then instead of talking about ages, to talk about grade levels,
I
for
do
example.
like
Yeah.
that.
So, because you can have an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old in a sixth grade class, and yet there's different
Yeah.
standards for those students, and the teachers have a hard time. So it's staff recommendation, and we'll be reaching out to a legislator to work with us on that.
Some I like, some I don't like, is my point. But I have one more
Okay, go ahead.
related, not related, but another. There had been some discussion that I know you've been involved with on the issues of residency, open enrollment, students with special needs. That's not in this list. Is that just in the back of your mind, or are you waiting for some more formal request, or what's the deal there?
Well, so there's a couple of things. So as you know, we've been working, so Assistant Superintendent Voorhees, she's back there, and I met with a number of attorneys, special ed directors. I'm trying to think, a couple, maybe assistant superintendents in districts about some of the issues that occur when students are placed in rehab centers or substance abuse centers in areas outside of the district where their parents reside. And a lot of it is about relationships with other state agencies that often are placing students or providing resources to families to place students in those centers. And so some of the work is about getting more of an understanding amongst the state agencies that are supporting these students, and how and an understanding for those agencies to know how they're impacting the schools or the school districts where those students are being placed. Some of it we think we could fix in board rule, but if you would like, Board Member Lear, one thing that I was going to talk about at the end of this is if there are statutory changes or policy changes that you would like to recommend and you would like to discuss in one of these meetings, and then ask us as staff to proactively work on them, we could work on developing a sentence, but I think that is a good thing. I will touch base with Assistant Superintendent Voorhees, as well as some of the members of our LEAs, the attorneys / special ed directors, and maybe that would be something that we should actively reach out to a legislator to address. But a lot of it is relationships and communication among agencies, and some of it we may actually be able to also solve in board rule. So.
And if that's the case, I just didn't want it to be forgotten in this list if changes are necessary, because I think there's some interest statewide in cleaning up some of those misunderstandings.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Board Member Hanson?
On that same vein, I think the people that were here from Tooele last month were from that same group that want to have, I don't know if you remember them, they gave the information in public comment. I think they're from that same group, and they have asked me to come out and talk to them because I'm the state board member over Tooele. And so they have concerns as well. I think we need to, I'm with Carol, I think we need to sit down and see if we can work everything out so it works out for everybody. I also talked to, I believe it was Representative Cutler, and Leah was there as well. And he was interested in perhaps doing something to help resolve it as well.
And just to clarify, Board Member Hanson, actually they are two different issues. One, the one that Board Member Lear is talking about is kind of addressing LEA concerns with how students being placed in their district without, sometimes, it's complex, but it's about the LEA and the student, whereas I think the issue you're dealing with is whether or not these centers can be appropriately licensed and certified, and then have some oversight from our office on them. So they are a little different. I actually have not met with that group. So the group, the issue that I was dealing with, they were all LEA representatives within board member.
Follow up.
Board Member Hanson?
And so you haven't met with that group?
I haven't.
Is anybody meeting with that group
Superintendent
to
did.
try to work out the issues with them? Because I know that I'm kind of caught up into it now.
Superintendent Dixon, go ahead.
I think I've had daily calls and some meetings over the last 3 weeks. So yes, we are working on it. And I can update you offline rather than going into all of
Okay,
it.
that would be great. Thank
Governor's
you.
office is involved, everybody's involved.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So may I just add that? So I think I'll just send out an email because perhaps you're all being, or many of you are being contacted or will be contacted. So I'll send you an email update just so that, kind of a progress report so that you know what we're working on.
Okay, we have a proposal that if a board member wants to take that proposal and add it to the list, that would require a board motion, so. Is there anybody that would like to move the audit proposal?
We don't.
Go ahead, Angie.
Just wanted to clarify that in the past, we haven't necessarily taken motions only because usually you wait till you see the actual bill, but just mostly in awareness that staff's working on these unless you want to tell us not to work on them. I think that's usually in the way we.
So it looks like in the past, we actually approved the request to be on the list. I believe each of them did have a motion that put them on the list, that we did approve that they were there.
It was kind of more of a without objection, staff will work on this, but
Okay.
just to clarify, that didn't happen. Sometimes they have, I think a motion is fine. I
Okay,
apologize.
no, that's okay.
I'm sorry.
Board Member Belknap?
Okay, if we're going to take a motion, then I'd like to make a motion that we accept the legislative request for the internal audit, that they might work on the, can I say verbiage? Or do you
Just
want
that-
me to be really clear on it?
Provide, just allow the board to meet
To
in
board,
closed session.
to allow the board to meet in a closed session to discuss the draft audits.
Okay, the motion before us is to move the legislative proposal for, to direct staff to move this legislative proposal regarding audits discussed in closed session. So, did I get that? Okay, is there any discussion to that motion? Okay, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, that motion passes unanimously. Okay.
Thank. Okay, that concludes our legislative policy, statutory priorities. Is that correct? Okay.